For 3 decades, Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was the king of late night, a nightly ritual in millions of homes. With his effortless charm, sharp wit, and iconic presence, Carson could launch a career with a single nod. But behind the smile and suit was a man who never forgot a slight. Cross him, and the price was steep. If you broke his unspoken rules, you might never be invited back. Some guests didn't just have a bad night, they committed unforgivable sins in his eyes. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Carson's blacklist. 11 guests who got on the wrong side of the king of late night. Joan Rivers. The deepest, most profound hatred Carson ever harbored was reserved for those he felt had personally betrayed his trust. This transgression was not merely a professional slight, but an existential threat to his influence. Joan Rivers holds the undisputed top spot on Carson's enemy list. For more than 2 decades, Rivers was one of The Tonight Show's most reliable and popular guests, meticulously groomed by Carson himself. She was a rarity in the mid-century comedy landscape, one of the few female stand-ups who achieved mainstream success, and she owed her big break directly to Carson's platform. He saw her potential, and she became his exclusive permanent guest host starting in 1983. The foundation of their partnership, however, was built on an unspoken contract: loyalty and deference. The contract shattered in 1986 when Rivers was offered her own competing late-night program on the then-fledgling Fox network, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. Rivers, understandably ambitious, took the job. However, the critical misstep that transformed professional competition into permanent, consuming hatred was the manner of her departure. She accepted the offer without consulting Carson or informing him personally, fearful that he would talk her out of it. Carson learned about the development from the news. This was viewed by him not as a professional move, but as an act of calculated personal treason. He felt she had stolen the secrets he taught her, used his platform to build her empire, and then challenged the king without even the courtesy of a farewell. This perceived disloyalty immediately triggered Carson's most vicious response. He instantly banned Rivers from the show, and critically, banned anyone who had her as a guest on their competing program. The grudge was so fierce and personal that Carson refused to speak to her ever again, maintaining an icy, vicious silence until his death in 2005. This extreme reaction, a permanent blacklisting of a protege, demonstrated that for Carson, loyalty was the most paramount virtue, and its violation was truly unforgivable. The fate of Joan Rivers' show confirmed the severity of Carson's wrath. While it was canceled a year later, the real damage was the permanent professional estrangement. Carson's power meant that for the remainder of his career, and even for years after, simply being associated with Rivers was enough to incur professional risk. While betrayal warranted Carson's most enduring hatred, guests who intentionally challenged his authority or violated the sacred boundaries of his set generated his most visible on-air discomfort and private fury. These guests did not want to share. They wanted to test the king. Charles Grodin. Charles Grodin remains one of the most polarizing and memorable guests in Tonight Show history. Grodin, an actor known for his dry, often hostile comedic persona, repeatedly appeared on the show playing an intentionally difficult, insecure, or even abusive character. His interviews were not traditional chats. They were a deliberate masterclass in adversarial humor. Grodin would aggressively test Carson's sincerity, often accusing him of being self-centered or uncaring about his guests' careers. For example, in one notorious clip, Grodin flatly asks Carson if he cares about the people he interviews. On the surface, Grodin's strategy seems like a direct violation of the law of loyalty and decorum. Yet, unlike Rivers, Grodin was invited back multiple times. The key to Grodin's unique position was that Carson initially tolerated, and perhaps even enjoyed, the manufactured tension this character created. It was compelling television. However, sustained manufactured hostility eventually wore thin. The relentless commitment to the bit became an exhausting experience for Carson, creating a hatred rooted in professional fatigue and annoyance, rather than genuine moral outrage. While Grodin's antagonism eventually landed him on the list of dreaded guests, his crime was one of persistent irritation that disrupted the host's ability to relax and deliver easy comedy, differentiating it from the instantaneous, vengeful exile reserved for personal traitors. Milton Berle. The hostility directed toward Milton Berle stemmed not from rivalry in the traditional sense, but from a profound generational and professional clash concerning the very nature of televised comedy. Berle, crowned Mr. Television, was a pioneer who had helped define the medium in its infancy during the late 1940s. He embodied the anything-goes spirit of vaudeville transplanted into early television. A chaotic, oversized personality who relied on physical humor, broad gags, and sheer force of will to dominate the stage. In contrast, Johnny Carson represented a newer, more refined era of comedy. Cool, self-contained, and professional. He was the host as conductor, orchestrating laughs with restraint, timing, and precise control. Carson wasn't just a talk show host, he was the embodiment of television's maturation. The clash, then, wasn't merely about screen time or ratings, it was about ethos. Berle's fundamental transgression in Carson's eyes was not that he was funnier or more popular, but that he refused to respect the carefully calibrated mechanics of the modern talk show. He was notorious for being a scene stealer, a performer whose need for attention knew no boundaries of etiquette or format. On Carson's Tonight Show, this manifested in his tendency to ignore time cues, hijack interviews, talk over the host, and deliver unsolicited routines, all of which disrupted the segmented, clockwork flow that Carson required to maintain the illusion of effortless charm. For Carson, whose entire persona was built on pitch-perfect timing, poise, and the subtle art of letting moments breathe, Berle's lack of discipline was not merely unprofessional, it was an existential threat to the kind of television Carson believed in. Backstage accounts often describe Carson's response to Berle not as open confrontation, but as a simmering, silent fury. He was known for his icy control, but Berle tested even his limits, refusing to play the supporting role that guests were expected to assume. This was more than a clash of personalities. It was symbolic of a broader transition in American entertainment. Carson's success hinged on creating an environment where the host maintained control, where the jokes served the rhythm of the show rather than the ego of the performer. Berle, by contrast, represented a fading model of television as raw performance, chaotic, improvisational, and dominated by singular personalities. When Berle appeared on The Tonight Show and attempted to reclaim the spotlight through sheer volume and presence, he was not just disrupting an interview, he was, in Carson's view, challenging the very foundation of the new television order. Ultimately, Carson's cold disdain for Berle was a quiet but forceful declaration. The future of comedy would be sleek, professional, and host-driven. There was no room anymore for the lumbering, ego-driven energy of vaudeville survivors. The medium had moved on, and so had its audience. Berle may have helped invent television, but Carson refined it, and he wasn't about to let anyone drag it backward. Gore Vidal. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was more than a late-night talk show. It was a cultural institution, a nightly ritual for millions of Americans seeking levity and calm at the end of the day. Carson's genius lay not only in his comedic timing or interview skills, but in his deep understanding of his role, to entertain without alienating. His format, built on universal lighthearted humor and sharp but gentle monologues, was carefully engineered to appeal to the broadest possible audience. In an era of deepening political and cultural divides, particularly during the turbulent 1970s and 1980s, Carson maintained an almost sacred boundary. The Tonight Show was not a platform for political grandstanding or ideological warfare. It was a sanctuary of non-polarizing entertainment. This rule was not merely implied, it was enforced with quiet but firm consistency. One of the most telling examples of this was Carson's decision to ban author and public intellectual Gore Vidal from future appearances. Vidal, known for his incisive wit and fierce political opinions, violated the unspoken compact between guest and host. Rather than playing along with the breezy tone of the show, he used his airtime to launch into serious, provocative political discourse, attacking public figures, critiquing American institutions, and injecting ideological heat into a space designed to remain cool and neutral. Unlike Carson's monologues, which occasionally poked fun at politicians with a wink and a smile, Vidal's remarks were sharp-edged, unapologetic, and divisive. He treated the platform not as entertainment, but as a pulpit. While the exact details of the offending appearance remain somewhat murky, lost in the haze of television history, the effect was unmistakable. The tone shifted. The audience tensed. And Carson, who monitored such changes with surgical precision, made a decision. Vidal would not be invited back. This wasn't about a personal vendetta or political disagreement. Carson, by most accounts, kept his own politics private and largely avoided taking public positions. The banishment of Vidal was a strategic defense of the Tonight Show brand, a line in the sand drawn to preserve the apolitical, unifying nature of the program. Carson understood better than most that his success depended on his ability to provide a common cultural space, one where Americans of all stripes could laugh at the same jokes and momentarily forget the battles raging outside their living rooms. In this light, Carson's response to Vidal wasn't censorship in the ideological sense. It was quality control, introducing high-stakes political controversy, especially through a guest with Vidal's intellectual firepower and combative style, risked alienating key segments of his viewership and threatening the show's delicate balance. Carson's audience was not niche. It was mainstream, vast, and diverse. Maintaining their trust meant refusing to allow The Tonight Show to become a platform for polarization. The decision to quietly blacklist Vidal was a reminder that Carson saw himself not merely as a host, but as a steward. In his eyes, the integrity of the show required vigilance not just against tasteless jokes or poor performances, but against anything that threatened to narrow its appeal or fracture its carefully cultivated mood. Vidal, brilliant though he was, had broken the spell, and Carson, ever the protector of his kingdom, acted swiftly to restore order. Kevin Nealon, who would later rise to fame as a cast member on Saturday Night Live, found himself quietly blacklisted from The Tonight Show after a single joke misfired during his appearance. While the exact content of the joke has faded into obscurity, what's remembered is that it didn't land. It either offended Johnny Carson or fell flat with the audience. In the high-stakes world of stand-up comedy and late-night television, this kind of failure wasn't just a bad night, it was a serious misstep. Carson, known for his precise comedic timing and carefully crafted monologues, had little tolerance for what he saw as a lack of polish. To him, a failed punchline was more than an awkward moment. It was a sign that the comedian hadn't mastered their craft. His standards were famously high, and he expected any performer on his stage to deliver jokes with confidence, precision, and respect for the audience's expectations. Nealon's mistake, minor as it may have seemed in the grand scheme, crossed an invisible but very real line. There was no dramatic fallout, no public scolding, just a quiet decision behind the scenes. He would not be invited back. Carson's response may seem harsh, but it reflected how seriously he took his role as both host and gatekeeper. What makes Nealon's ban particularly striking is how small the transgression was. It wasn't scandalous or inappropriate by broader standards, but in Carson's tightly controlled world, where tone, timing, and audience rapport were everything, it was enough. The episode illustrates just how ruthlessly Carson protected the quality and reputation of his show. For comedians, it was both an opportunity and a test, and not everyone got a second chance. Howie Mandel's sin was one of professional chaos. Known for his high-energy physical comedy, Mandel brought a level of unpredictability that clashed with the carefully controlled environment Johnny Carson demanded. One particular incident, often linked to Mandel's infamous rubber glove bit, where he inflates a surgical glove on his head, crossed an invisible but strict boundary. Whether it was that routine or another similarly disruptive prop, the act introduced real, unscripted mess and noise to a set that thrived on precision and polish. The Tonight Show desk was sacred. It symbolized order, control, and Carson's cool, measured authority as a host. Any guest who violated the physical space of the desk or created genuine unpredictability on stage was, in Carson's eyes, threatening the very foundation of the show. He was famously a control freak, not in a hostile way, but in a way that demanded every moment of the broadcast function smoothly, with no surprises that weren't scripted or easily managed. Mandel's brand of comedy forced Carson to react physically, something he hated. It broke the illusion of control, pulled him out of his carefully crafted persona, and created a moment of real disorder on live television. For Carson, this wasn't a harmless gag. It was a disruption of the show's mechanics and an assault on the controlled environment he had spent decades perfecting. The response was swift and firm. Mandel, like Kevin Nealon before him, was blackballed. The punishment may seem extreme after all. Mandel's bit was meant to be funny, not disrespectful, but Carson saw even minor infractions as major threats. If a guest couldn't respect the format, they didn't deserve the platform. To Carson, protecting the tone and flow of The Tonight Show was more important than giving second chances. Mandel's banishment was a clear message. Chaos, no matter how funny, had no place behind The Tonight Show desk. Here's a more streamlined and expanded version of your text, preserving the original insights while refining the flow and clarity. Crispin Glover. If Howie Mandel represented a kind of controlled chaos, a wild energy that still operated within the realm of comedy, Crispin Glover stood for something far more dangerous to Johnny Carson's world: unfiltered theatrical unpredictability. While Glover's most infamous moment of erratic behavior occurred on Late Night with David Letterman in 1987, where he ranted incoherently, wore eccentric clothing, and famously attempted a karate kick near Letterman's face, the type of unpredictability he brought was exactly the sort Carson sought to avoid at all costs. In fact, Carson had a near instinctive reaction to such guests, often moving to preemptively block them before they even had a chance to appear. Carson's Tonight Show required a fundamental level of structure and decorum. While it may have looked effortless on screen, it was a tightly choreographed performance, and Carson's famously private, shy nature meant that he was deeply uncomfortable when that structure broke down. He was not a confrontational host. He did not enjoy conflict, tension, or emotional exposure. Guests who came across as mentally unstable, intoxicated, or who deliberately adopted incoherent or extreme personas violated an unspoken but iron rule: the guest must be manageable. Glover, whose persona blurred the line between performance art and actual instability, posed a unique threat. His energy was not the calculated tension of someone like Charles Grodin, who sparred with hosts in a knowing, tongue-in-cheek manner. Glover's performances felt untethered from any shared understanding of the show's goals or boundaries. Whether he was truly unhinged or simply committing so fully to an absurdist character that it seemed real didn't matter to Carson. What mattered was that Glover represented a live wire risk that couldn't be controlled. And for Carson, control was everything. When guests like Glover derailed an interview, Carson's response was swift and telling. Accounts from former staff and writers frequently describe moments where a guest veered into erratic territory, prompting Carson to silently but firmly end the conversation by cutting to commercial. There was no public scolding or argument, just an immediate removal from the stage and, more importantly, the booking list. Carson operated with an unspoken no rebook policy for anyone who pushed him into an unscripted and emotionally exposed role, something he viewed not just as unprofessional, but as a personal violation. In this way, Carson's contempt wasn't just for bad comedy or poor timing. It was for any situation that forced him to abandon the polished, safe persona he had carefully constructed. His stage was a space of control, grace, and composure. Glover, by nature or by choice, threatened all of that. And in Carson's world, that was the most unforgivable sin of all. Here's a slightly expanded, polished version of your Tony Randall segment. The tone is clear and respectful, while digging a bit deeper into Carson's perspective and the mechanics of late-night television. Tony Randall. Tony Randall, a respected stage and screen actor known for his intelligence and cultured persona, seemed at first glance like an ideal guest for The Tonight Show. He was articulate, witty, and well-liked by audiences. But despite his credentials and charm, Randall became a recurring source of professional irritation for Johnny Carson, not because of anything scandalous or offensive, but because he violated one of the most fundamental rules of late-night television: pacing. Carson's show was a precisely timed machine. Every segment, monologue, and commercial break was choreographed to keep the show moving at an ideal rhythm. Timing wasn't just a technical requirement, it was at the heart of Carson's comedic style. His monologues were built on short, sharp punchlines, and his interviews were carefully designed to hit the right beats, offer a few laughs, and move along without dragging. Carson's brilliance lived in that economy. He knew exactly how long a moment should last to be funny and when to cut away before it soured. Randall, however, operated by an entirely different rhythm. Erudite and verbose, he often treated his interviews as opportunities for extended storytelling, intellectual musings, or theatrical monologues. He had little concern for Carson's cues or the unspoken clock ticking behind every segment. Randall would frequently speak over attempts to redirect or wrap up, launching into long-winded anecdotes that, while occasionally interesting, drained energy from the room and left Carson and his production team scrambling to regain control. For Carson, this was more than a nuisance. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the show's purpose. A segment that dragged didn't just risk losing laughs, it risked losing viewers. Worse, it showed a lack of respect for the tightly engineered nature of the format, which Carson saw not just as a technical framework, but as a creative art form. The pacing wasn't arbitrary. It was the very thing that made the show work. Carson, ever the professional, rarely erupted in frustration on air, but his body language told the story. As Randall rambled on, Carson might lean back in his chair, fix a distant stare at the studio monitor, or sharply pivot the conversation to Ed McMahon. Subtle but unmistakable signs that he was displeased. These weren't gestures of personal animosity. They were expressions of professional exasperation. Randall simply didn't play by the rules of the medium, and Carson, a master of those rules, had little patience for that. In Carson's view, every guest had a responsibility to fit within the rhythm of the show, deliver something memorable, and leave the audience wanting more. Randall, for all his intelligence and good intentions, violated that contract. His long-windedness wasn't just a quirk, it was a threat to the timing and flow that defined Carson's legacy. Joey Bishop. Joey Bishop was a well-established figure from the golden era of the Rat Pack, and a familiar face in the world of mid-century television. As one of the few entertainers who dared challenge Johnny Carson during the volatile late-night wars of the 1960s, Bishop had once helmed his own competing talk show. Though his show ultimately failed to unseat The Tonight Show, his legacy lingered, making his occasional appearances with Carson feel more like obligatory acknowledgments than moments of genuine camaraderie. Carson was not known for extending warmth to former rivals. He preferred dominance to diplomacy and was notorious for quietly freezing out anyone who had threatened his hold on late-night television. In this light, Bishop's guest spots were less about mutual respect and more about optics, a nod to his enduring fame and industry connections rather than any genuine desire to feature him. His presence, stiff and slightly formal, lacked the spark Carson enjoyed with his most favored guests. Bishop represented something Carson disliked being reminded of: competition. And not just competition, but past competition, an era when Carson's supremacy was still in question. By the time Bishop appeared as a guest, Carson had already emerged the uncontested king of late night. Yet Bishop's presence, even if subdued, was a ghost of that earlier, unsettled time. He was, in effect, a living footnote to a battle Carson preferred to forget. Carson, ever strategic, maintained a professional but distant posture during Bishop's segments. The interviews were brief, controlled, and lacked the warmth or spontaneity Carson reserved for those he trusted and admired. There was no generous stage sharing, no extended back and forth. Bishop was offered the respect due to a veteran entertainer, but only just. He was kept at arm's length, a reminder to both the audience and to himself that while he had once been a contender, Carson now ruled alone. In the economy of Carson's Tonight Show, where time was currency and every segment shaped the narrative of cultural power, Bishop was a costly booking with little return. He did not contribute to the show's energy, nor did he align with Carson's preferred image of effortless, uncontested mastery. His appearances were tolerated, not celebrated, and when they faded away entirely, they did so without notice. Here's an expanded and slightly polished version of your text that deepens the psychological and professional dynamics between Johnny Carson and Bob Hope, while maintaining your original insights. Bob Hope. Bob Hope was a towering figure in American comedy, a pioneer whose rapid-fire, topical humor helped shape the DNA of modern late-night television. Long before Johnny Carson became the undisputed king of The Tonight Show, Hope had set the template: sharp monologues, topical zingers, and a blend of Hollywood charm with political edge. He was not just a comedian, he was an institution, and yet, despite this legacy, the relationship between Carson and Hope was marked by quiet, persistent tension. Carson reportedly harbored deep discomfort with Hope's presence, though he remained publicly respectful. Part of that discomfort stemmed from what Carson saw as a professional laziness on Hope's part, his tendency to recycle material, rely heavily on cue cards, and coast on reputation rather than craft. In Carson's eyes, comedy was a living, evolving discipline requiring timing, effort, and adaptation. Hope, still performing with the cadence and material of a bygone era, represented a refusal to evolve. His appearances, often pre-scripted and heavily managed by his handlers, felt out of sync with Carson's slick, more spontaneous brand of late-night performance. Beyond the stylistic divide, there was a deeper, more personal source of tension. Hope had long been a gatekeeper in American entertainment, a paternal figure whose approval once signaled success. But Carson, by the 1970s and 80s, had clearly outpaced his predecessor. While Hope maintained his celebrity status, his comedic relevance had faded. Carson resented what he perceived as Hope's inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the shift in power. According to insiders, Carson felt Hope still carried himself as if he were the rightful head of the comedic hierarchy, a posture Carson found both outdated and quietly patronizing. Their interactions on The Tonight Show reflected this underlying power struggle. Hope was always treated with surface-level deference. He was, after all, Bob Hope, but Carson was careful to keep the spotlight from lingering too long on his predecessor. Segments were tightly managed, laughs were politely received, but the chemistry was noticeably flat. Carson never gave Hope the open, playful space he reserved for guests he admired or enjoyed. Instead, he enforced a subtle but unmistakable hierarchy. Hope was the honored elder, but Carson was the reigning monarch. In this way, Carson navigated the tension with calculated professionalism. There was no public feud, no sharp exchange, but behind the curtain there was a clear message. The era of Bob Hope had passed. The torch had not simply been handed down, it had been taken. And Carson was determined to remind everyone, Hope included, who now held it. Orson Welles. Orson Welles brought a towering presence to The Tonight Show in the 1970s and early 80s, equal parts legend and disruption. Known for his sweeping stories, intellectual flourishes, and theatrical delivery, Welles often dominated his segments, turning interviews into monologues. While his charisma initially captivated, his long-winded, self-indulgent style gradually wore thin on Johnny Carson, who valued pace, balance, and the host's control over the room. A 1978 appearance typified the clash. Welles launched into a meandering tale about his travels in Europe, complete with obscure references and philosophical tangents. Carson, sidelined, leaned back silently, offering only a strained smile. Welles's on-air wine-sipping, which became a minor trademark of his visits, further tested the show's tone. In a 1980 appearance, he slurred slightly while discussing Citizen Kane, prompting a visible eyebrow raise from Carson, his signature signal of irritation. Carson, a master of timing and shared spotlight, grew increasingly frustrated with Welles' refusal to yield conversational space. In a 1976 segment, Welles dismissed one of Carson's jokes with a lofty, "Oh, Johnny, you wouldn't understand." The tension was palpable, punctuated by Carson's knowing stare into the camera, half disbelief, half comedic release. By 1979, the host's patience wore thin. When Welles wandered into a monologue about unfinished film projects, Carson cut him off with a sharp, "Let's move on, Orson," the irritation barely concealed. Welles, once a frequent guest, began appearing less often. In a 1981 interview, the imbalance between the two was unmistakable. Welles held court with tales of old Hollywood, brushing past Carson's attempts to steer the tone lighter. The host's responses were clipped, his segue to commercial abrupt. As Welles became more theatrical and less self-aware, Carson's tolerance dwindled. What truly irked Carson was more than just long stories. It was Welles's disregard for the format. Welles represented the kind of intellectual self-importance Carson instinctively pushed against. His disregard for pacing, reluctance to share space, and condescending tone violated the unspoken rules of the show. Carson's brand was built on smooth rhythm and mutual respect between host and guest. Welles, by turning the desk into his personal stage, disrupted that balance. Though Carson never openly criticized Welles, his expressions told the story. Polite, professional, but clearly frustrated. Behind the scenes, it was evident that Orson Welles had become a guest more endured than enjoyed. What do these fractured guest relationships reveal about Johnny Carson? Was his strict control a mark of professionalism, or did it ultimately limit the kind of creative chaos that can make live television unforgettable? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into late-night legends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from behind the curtain. Thanks for watching.